Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining me this afternoon to talk about virtual power plants. Maybe as an introduction, I want to point out, and I think it will echo some of the things that were said this morning, that the electricity consumption is set to triple by 2050. We need massive electrification to cut down emissions from the building, from the industry, from the transport sectors. The solar and wind power are being deployed massively in the world, but there are a key bottleneck, which is the grid, both the transmission and the distribution grids. Permitting delays, connection, limited capacity at both the transmission and distribution level are key roadblocks. And I think, the context with what happened in Spain last week is actually key to show that the network needs more flexibility. And this is where virtual power plants, or VPP, comes in. Virtual power plants are orchestration of customer energy resources. They enable car parks, homes, businesses, factories to orchestrate their production, store it, and feed it back to the grid when required. This enables more energy resilience and also a cleaner, more affordable energy sources. But to be able to scale VPP globally, we need some reforms, some specific regulatory support, and we need to be able to drive reforms efficiently. To that end, we've developed at Blunomy the VPP Readiness Index that I will present today, that are looking at three key factors: commercial, regulatory, and technical, to try to identify what is working well, what are the gaps, and how we can compare different countries. So before going into more details, I want probably just to thank and recognize the support of Integrate to Zero that was supporting Blunomy in developing that index. Integrate to Zero is a non-for-profit philanthropic that is focusing on driving the widespread adoption of VPP globally. And Blunomy is a consultancy advancing energy and climate transition solutions. So my name is Pierre Laurent. I'm partner at Blunomy, and I've got Clifton in the room, one of my colleagues that will be happy to answer any questions you may have afterwards. In the next 50 minutes or so, I want to talk to you about what VPPs are and what are their benefits, how we develop the index, and of course the result of the index and the key learnings associated to that. So to start with, what are VPPs and why do we need flexibility? So we need flexibility, and I think again, in what happened in Spain, even if the root causes are not understood well now, everyone is agreeing to say that more flexibility in the network would have been a good thing. We need more flexibility for three main reasons. The first one, on the supply side, there might be some enforcing problem and shutdowns. It could be solar plants that are cutting out of the grid in an unexpected manner. It could be an anticipated maintenance in coal or gas power plant or baseload, for example. The second reason is the increased penetration of variable renewable energies, mostly solar and wind, that might have different patterns of production depending on the cloud coverage or depending on the wind patterns. And the last one is the demand side variations. It could be daily, weekly, and seasonal consumption. To give you an example, a 1 degree Celsius drop in France in winter equates to a 2.4 gigawatt change in consumption. 2.4 gigawatt, that's the scale of, let's say, 1 or 2 nuclear reactor, right? So we're not talking small scale. And we believe at Blunomy that there are a couple of market trends that are underpinning that need for flexibility that are going to be there in the long term. The first one is that solar and wind are forecast to thrive in pretty much every country, and a lot of countries are making plans to drive the uptake of variable renewable energy. Similarly, the fossil fuel fired are coming down, mostly driven by the agenda around climate change. The low carbon dispatchable, so mostly hydro and renewable, are also coming down massively, mostly because of political decisions. Nuclear, we all know the questions around the safety, and hydro has a lot of impact on the environment and probably also requires some specific geographic sites that are not so widespread available. The fourth reason is the massive electric consumption increase that is set to arrive in the next decades or so. We're talking about electrification of transport, of industry, of heating. There's also the AI type of new consumption that is coming, which is just massive compared to what already exists. And last but not least, the changing geopolitical landscape. We've seen, for example, with the war in Ukraine, the impact on the gas prices in the securing supply from Europe around gas, which is creating a lot of headaches to the governments in terms of energy security, and having flexibility seasonally, daily, weekly in the system can be of great importance for the governments moving forward. So what are VPPs in all of this, and what can they bring? So VPPs, or virtual power plants, are really about orchestration of consumer energy resources. And we classify energy resources in three main categories. The first one is distributed generation. So that's typically solar rooftop. Most of the customer energy resources that we can think about, even in Asia, are solar rooftop, but there are some, let's say, biomass, for example, or small wind type of resources that could be on site behind the meter. The second category are energy storage. So we're talking about stationary storage, typically your home battery. It could also be your electric vehicle. And the third category, which is much broader and encompasses a lot of things, is flexible load. Flexible load can go from the smart kettle to the hot water system to your cooling device, for example, in your home, as long as it can be controlled remotely. And when we look at what are VPPs in the system, right? If you start about the categories of customer energy resources that we talked about recently, distributed generation, storage, and flexible load, they are equipping different types of customers, residential, commercial, industrials, and those consumers are being served by the system, so the generation, transmission, distribution, power system. The VPPs are really here to connect the consumers and the fleets of customer energy resources to the system via digital platform or market interfaces when there are some markets. So this is a technical view of what VPPs are. From an economic standpoint, and I think it's important if we want to be able to finance and scale those projects, it can be actually quite different depending on the countries and the regulatory framework. And not all countries are created equal. We identified three main types of environments in terms of market and regulation for VPP projects to fly in. The first one, which is probably the most favorable, is typically the case of unbundled and accessible markets. So this is typically in countries like Australia, France, the UK, Chile, Colombia, or India, where there are existing markets that VPP can access. The power system is unbundled, meaning that the transmission, distribution, generation, and retail activities are done by separate entities. The second type of systems, which is probably a middle ground, is where the system is unbundled, but there is no market, meaning that there is competition, and VPP project operators, as the third party, can access the system. But they will have to go through bilateral contracts, most likely with the utility, because there is no markets to attain revenues. This is typically the case for Brazil, Kenya, or South Africa. And the third one is where there is a vertically integrated utility. So that's the case, for example, very close to Singapore with Malaysia or Indonesia, or for example in Nigeria in Africa. In that case, virtual power plants projects are very hard to set up for third party, and it's really only the parent utility that can drive them and can leverage those to do some internal cost control. So the business model and the revenue models can be quite varied, as you can see, which is one of the hurdles for the wide-scale development of virtual power plants. Nonetheless, some of the benefits that are being brought by the virtual power plants are quite similar across the board, and we categorize them in two main buckets. The first one is around the power system. Power system benefits. So what VPPs do is that they bring flexibility, meaning that they reduce the load curve, which can in sequence reduce the spending on the centralized generation and storage to procure and supply this electricity. The second one is similar. By flattening the load curve, the virtual power plants can reduce the spending on the networks, bringing more flexibility at the connection level and enabling more connection without having to upgrade and spend capex on the transmission and distribution network. The second bucket of benefits are societal benefits. This is particularly true if VPPs manage to displace some of the heavy fossil fuel generation. So there could be some greenhouse gas reduction, some pollutant emission reductions, and that would increase also the social equity value. So now that we've looked at what VPPs were and what benefits they could bring, we can have a look at what do we need to scale virtual power plants and how can they thrive? What do we need for a project of virtual power plant to scale, right? So the team at Integrate to Zero and Blunomy asked ourselves the question, okay, what is required for a VPP project to be investable and bankable? The first criteria is that we need to have some resource availability. So we need to have customer energy resources to orchestrate. So it could be solar panels, could be batteries, it could be flexible load, but there need to be some uptake of customer energy resources in the country. Second, there needs to be some flexibility needs. All countries are not created equal. If you think about France or Australia, for example, they're very picky, meaning that their maximum demand compared to the average demand is very high. There's a very high ratio. In France, the cold in winter is driving that. In Australia, the heat and the AC consumption is driving that. If you look at a country like Malaysia, for example, it's pretty flat. So the ratio between the maximum demand and the average demand is actually pretty low, meaning that the flexibility need is not that high. Third, market attractiveness. Is there a system in place, some regulation, some markets for VPP to access this revenue? Fourth, is the regulatory environment safe enough for investor to put some money on those projects? And fifth, the grid operation. The grid operation is mostly around smart meter deployment. We do need smart meter to be able to operate virtual power plants, which is a key criteria in assessing the suitability of countries. So now looking at the index results at a very high level, we can split the results in three main buckets. Countries that are highly ready for VPP adoption at scale, countries that are in the moderate readiness bucket, and countries that are pretty low in terms of readiness for VPPs, right? So in the first bucket, you can find Australia, France, and the UK, where they've got, those countries have pretty strong customer energy resources uptake. They've got good regulatory framework. It's more about, you know, improving some of the specific factors to be able to further develop VPPs. But I will point out that especially in France and the UK, virtual power plants are already commercial in those countries. Moderate readiness is the bigger bucket, I would say, with Chile, India, Brazil, South Africa, Colombia, Malaysia, and Kenya. It's much more diverse in terms of where they strongly perform versus where they're weak. Some important reforms are required most often in terms of market attractiveness and regulatory environment, because there is a strong VPP resource availability uptake in those countries. And in the last bucket, you have Indonesia and Nigeria, where there's major reforms required from a VPP standpoint required, mostly around the regulatory and market attractiveness. And also the VPP resource availability is not there, so we will need reforms to drive the uptake of solar, batteries, EVs in those countries. Beside the results on a per country and comparing the different countries, I think what is important as well is a couple of key takeaways that we had, and you can see that consumer energy resources, yes, but with VPPs, because the first key takeaway is that most countries focus on supporting the uptake of customer energy resources, be it solar, storage, electric vehicle, but are lagging behind or forgetting a bit the virtual power plants, although Singapore do have some VPP sandbox that are being driven by EMA at the moment. The second point is that most countries have actually quite a lot of CR capacity. They, in average, have 40% of maximum demand available in installed capacity of customer energy resources, which is quite significant. If you think that you could reduce maximum demand by 40% in every country, that would be a massive saving in terms of investments, both in terms of generation and transmission. Third is that there's still a lack of adequate regulation and access to revenue streams. A lot of the regulation, even if the technology agnostic, do favor CapEx intensive solutions, whereas VPP is very OpEx intensive. And last but not least, we do need smart meter rollout, as I pointed out earlier, to be able to enable the uptake of virtual power plants. There is 100% smart meter rollout in the UK and in France, but that's the only two countries among the countries that we looked at. Australia is probably around 40%. In Southeast Asia, there's a number of countries that are looking at it closely and have plans for smart meter rollout, but they're not there yet, and that will be required. So that was the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm happy, and my colleague Clifton is also here to answer any questions you may have on virtual power plants. You can access the report through the QR code, and you can also reach me by email. And happy to take some questions also after of the scene. Thanks everyone.